so we're going to talk about growing tomatoes. For the most part, we'll have a little bit of a review on, I think starting from seeds, location, preparation, okay, selecting a variety, starting from seed. So that'll be a review. If you missed the first class, it'll be good for you to get that. It'll be a little fast for those of you who are in the seed class. Sometimes tomato seeds have a little different means that we need to work with them, okay? Maybe it's partly because I just want tomatoes so badly I get a little bit excited when I'm starting the seeds. Peas, who cares? You know. Okay, so we're also going to talk about the cultural techniques, which includes kind of the care of seedlings. We're going to talk about steps to having ripe tomatoes earlier, because we can have ripe tomatoes in June. Now, I do love tomatoes, but I do not always do all those steps because we have to fit it into our lifestyles, okay? So we're going to present to you the things that are the best to do, that work the best, and will get you the earliest tomatoes, and you may not be able to do them all. So try to select the ones that work for you. Okay, with all of that, tomatoes need 8 hours or more of sun. Now, that's after we get them in the ground. That's after you've already grown them a couple of months, or you're buying a little plant that's in a 3-inch pot, okay? They really prefer a well-drained soil, something that raised beds usually give you, but you may be able to work your own soil, get enough organics in over the years, that will be a good draining soil as well, okay? And we really need to protect them from wind. What are you supposed to be having to protect them from wind? It sucks the moisture right out of the poor things. Okay, so the roots can't always keep up with their moisture needs if you've got a wind. And it also is going to change the temperature around them, the air temperature. And then the other thing, we want to avoid low spots. Why would we want to avoid low spots? Wet and cold. So we're talking about cold air temperatures. Cold air settles in low pockets. So if you're going to start a tomato garden and you have a little bit of a slope, a fence at the bottom of the slope, where are you going to avoid planting your tomatoes? By the fence, because that's going to hold that cold air in, okay? You can do a raised bed and that'll lift it up a little bit more. But you don't want the cold air and the cold water that drain to the lowest spot in your yard to be where you plant your tomatoes. Sometimes it happens that's the only spot that we have that gives you 8 hours of sun. So then you're going to need to modify a little bit. Don't put them too close to the fence. Try to give them a little bit of a raised bed for that type of situation. Okay. Soil preparation. It's like any other time you're getting ready to do a garden bed. How many of you are going to be starting from making a garden bed? You all starting from a set garden bed already. Fantastic. Because if you aren't, it's a little more work. You need to take out any large rocks, you need to dig out weeds, particularly the ones that need to be dug are things like your blackberries and your dandelions. And your dandelions, you know, if you just cut the top off of them, they'll be right back in a multitude, okay? So you always want to get that taken care of. So, you know, if you've already got a bed, you really don't have quite as much work to do. You're either going to till, and we don't recommend tilling more than once a year because it destroys the colony of microorganisms in the soil that help the plants draw up nutrients, okay? And so you can either use a fork or a shovel. If you've got any rocks at all, you may want to use the fork because it goes through the soil a little better. And we don't care if we've got rocks that are 1 inch or so in size. It's the bigger rocks we don't want. You can pick those out and put them on the side. But if these are already established, you're basically going to slightly turn the soil. You're going to put in some composted material, already composted. And you're going to mix that in. And if you have other things like, I think these are just leaves on the top, you can work those in. Those are partially composted, okay? We're still early enough that those will probably decompose by the time you're ready to get your tomatoes in June. See, this is March. That's still a ways off, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so that anything you put in here, as the soil warms more and more, it will decompose faster, and the microorganisms get happier the warmer it gets, the harder they work. So, and then you're going to be looking, this is obviously the time to do your pH testing. How many of you brought your soil samples today? Great. Don't forget to pick them up on your way out. I know it's still a little early, but don't forget them. So we've added our organic matter and we've turned it in. I usually like to turn the soil a little bit first and then add the compost and then work it in. It's kind of a three-step thing. It'll seem like it takes you a little longer, and it may, but it's better than trying to turn everything in at once. It's a lot more work, you're lifting more, and you're working harder, because then if you've got any clods in the soil itself, you're going to have to use the back of the shovel and wham them, or you're going to do 2 or 3 cuts to break them up a little smaller so they fall apart a little better. So in that case, work from the bottom up. If you're just starting a bed, you can do the bottom, dig out some of the soil and just pile it on top of your compost, and then you work it in as you're putting it back in. Raised beds you can do that pretty easily with. Okay, so we know the pH needs to be right around 7. Tomato plants do require space. The minimum for good growth is going to be 2 feet by 2 feet. Okay? Which means you want them to be like 4 feet apart. Okay? That will give each plant that much. If you're going to put them in a container, that container also needs to be at least 2 feet deep. Tomato roots go pretty deep. There are some container tomatoes that the roots don't take up as much space, the top doesn't take up as much space, and you still end up with tomatoes. Typically they're a little small, but they will do fine, okay? There are advantages to containers. Okay, so we've got our 2 feet by 2 feet. Now, should you decide that you want to get a grafted tomato, you need to have even more space between them. Those buggers get big. So you would need at least 3 feet by 3 feet. Now, most of mine are the normal ones, just 2 feet by 2 feet, and I give them a little more than that because they get so happy as they grow. Depends on what type of tomato, but if they're an indeterminate, they're going to go for the gusto. And I end up having them flop over each other, and that's being 4 feet apart. You're thinking, So as you grow, if you don't have the space, that's fine, but think about cutting back instead of trying to plant too many more. Okay, varieties. We have sort of 3 groups here. Grazing. Everybody knows what a grazing tomato would be? Oh yeah, I can tell by the chuckles. So let's just have 3 or 4 of these. Yes. So there are some of these. The Sun Gold I really like as a grazing one. Any of the smallish tomatoes that you can kind of pop in your mouth, those are all ones I call grazing. Okay, you need a couple, 3, depending on how big your garden is. You know, I think one of our gardeners here said he has one on each side of his garden, so he's not too far away from food source. And then there are a lot of us that like to put tomatoes up so we can have tomatoes through the winter. And those are typically going to be Euromas. And Euromas are going to be a thicker fleshed and less in the seed chamber. The seed chamber for something like a big beef, you've still got a lot of flesh, but you've got a lot of juice. You know, you put them in a sandwich, you squeeze that just a little bit, and you have tomato juice running down your arm, dripping off your elbow. Okay, and those happen to be the slicing ones. And what is a hamburger without the juice of the tomato coming out? So, slicing are going to be things like your big beef, your black crim, brandywine. There are many, many varieties out here. These are just some that I'm pretty familiar with. The paste and Romas, there's a whole selection of those, and you'll find some that are just called Roma. And I'm not sure exactly what type they are. I mean, who are they really? Because if I go and ask for a Roma, how am I going to get the same thing? So I like it to be a little bit more defined. So if I like Prince Borghese, that one's kind of between a Roma and a grazing because it tends to be small for a Roma tomato. Prolific, but small. So there's a lot of variety there. Determinate or indeterminate? Well, tomatoes fall into these categories as well. Your determinant are ones that usually don't grow real tall. They're considered a bush tomato. They don't usually take up quite as much space, which is kind of nice for small gardens. They usually bloom all about the same time, which means the fruit ripens all about the same time. Which means if you're going to can, you don't have to wait 4 weeks, and you don't have to freeze part of them before you can can them, okay? It usually will give you enough within a couple of weeks that you've got a quantity you can work with. Legend and Willamette are a couple, I believe, were OSU varieties that they developed. If not, they're ones I know that are used here frequently. And then you have indeterminate. Indeterminates are the ones that really do not know when to stop growing. They will stop growing when it freezes. They are the ones that leave you needing a lot of recipes for green tomatoes. And if you don't do green tomatoes, you're going to have a lot that fall on the ground once we have a frost. Now, of course, the other thing you can do with green tomatoes is you can actually pick them and take them in for ripening. I think we talk about that at the end. So, Early Girl is indeed an earlier variety, but some of your tomatoes, the ones that are early, are going to be right around 55 days after transplant to have ripe fruit. That's already 2 months. And then there's some that I have that are like 120 days. You know what that counts out to? An awful long time. Okay, briefly on seeds. Yes, you can get seeds. We have pretty good availability for plants these days. We have a lot that are just doing heirlooms. But the greatest variety is going to be your seeds, because what if you have a friend who gives you a really wonderful tomato that he's grown from seed? Yeah, you probably won't find it anywhere. You need to start them early. If you go with plants, you can usually buy little plants into May, and that's at the 3-inch size. And by the time June rolls around, you can even buy them in gallon pots. They're a little harder to get into the ground, but you can still have tomatoes that will be ripe about the right time. The cost is lowest with seeds. The cost is usually not too great with a small plant. As you get bigger, of course, it costs more. More varieties, okay, fewer varieties, but you can get quite a few of your hybrids in a plant form. You can get some of them in seed, but you have to buy the seed every year because hybrids will not come true. And hybrids sometimes are disease resistant for various things. If you've had problems with your plants before, you might want to go with one that's resistant. And of course, there's always the joy of raising a plant from seed to harvest. There's just something about that kind of leaves a little bit of glow. Supplies. There are many supplies out on the back. We're going to run through these. Labels, seeds, clean starter tray, moist seedling mix, a lid or plastic bag, a heat-controlled heat mat, and a fluorescent light as your grow light. I like soaking the seeds first myself because I'm a little antsy for them to come up. If I just plant them into the little seed tray or something, the next thing I have my finger trying to see if they've germinated. I mean, what if the seed was back and I need to reseed? Yeah. So I have a real bad habit there. These are actually germinated a little bit further than I like. You have to take the extra care of poking a little hole and getting those roots down in there, but it works. So you would see, I found this to be a little easier where the seeds are soaked and I put them on the top of seedling mix where they're going to actually be growing. You can actually space them a little better that way, and then you just put those in a bag or put a cover over them. Mostly at my house is to keep the cats out because they're pretty nosy. And they can get away with seeds pretty fast and make a big mess in the process. So we're going to water those in with a spray bottle. The soil is already moist. And then we're going to go on to germinating them on the paper towel or germinating them, as I said, on the soil, the seedling mix. Eventually they get covered with about 1/4 inch of the seedling mix, watered in, placed under the grow light and back on the heat mat, and that's kind of our review of growing from seed. At the second true leaf, which means, what's the first leaf that comes up? Cotyledons. The first one provides nutrients to the plant as it's growing as a seed. Once those wither, you need to be doing some fertilizing. Seedling mix is typically, it's a soilless mix, so it typically doesn't have nutrients much at all. Okay, so it says if the roots are reaching the edge, then it's probably time to go ahead and repot. And when we repot, we want to put tomato plants into a deeper container so that the stem is buried. Tomatoes are the main one I know of that will grow new roots along that stem. If you've grown tomatoes before and the foliage is kind of draped down over the stem or the trunk of the tomato, you may notice a bunch of little funny knobbies down close to the soil. Those are roots. They really like to be in the soil. So you can plant them deeper every time. Again, at the 3-inch, you're going to go into a 3-inch probably from the plug size and still use seedling mix. Seedling is fine, it's light, it's easy for the roots to grow into, and it usually doesn't take very long. Tomato plants double in size every week. So that means if you start with a 4-inch little plant, next week it's going to be 8 inches. From the time you buy one in a 3-inch pot, those have already been in there for a while. So when you go home, you need to be ready to take it from a 3-inch pot to a gallon pot. So usually May is a good time to buy your 3-inchers. If you've grown them your own, then it probably is going to take a little while. Hold them only by the leaves. Why would we do that? If you nip off the stem, that's curtains for the plant. Okay. Then you can bury them all the way. You don't have to worry. Okay. Now, at the 3-inch, most of them, if you buy at a 3-inch size, let me see if we can go forward and have, okay. If they're in the 3-inch pot already, typically, if you're buying them out, they have already been hardened off. Hardened off is gradually getting them used to the outdoors. Shade first, dappled sun, then you're going to move them into a part day of sun, then a full day of sun. It can take 1 to 2 weeks because if it gets too cold in the daytime or at night, you're going to have to bring them inside. So, okay, this weather has been so crazy, you don't know now whether it's going to be 35 degrees outside like it was yesterday or whether it's going to be closer to 50 degrees. So you just are going to have to kind of keep track of the weather. And that's kind of March, April, June. You're going to check the roots again. If you're buying a plant, you really do have to check the roots. They could be all wound around, and tomato plants don't like their roots being disturbed either. So if they're wound around, set them back down and don't take them home. You're going to have to cut into those roots, and when you cut into the roots, it's going to set it back a bit. And these are tropical plants. We've got to remember that. These are tropical plants, and this is not the tropics. I suspect most people have noticed that. Okay, make sure you don't have any pests on the plants that you've purchased. So they're going to be about 6 to 10 inches in a 3-inch pot. 6 inches is better. 10, they're going to start getting a little root bound. And you're going to repot them into a regular nursery size. Nursery size, they say it's a 1-gallon pot. I don't know a gallon of exactly what, but it's not liquid gallon. So you're going to get them into that size, which means you're going to repot them. At the 3-inch size, sometimes you can get them into the ground, but you will have needed to take the steps of pre-warming your soil, which means you're going to put plastic mulch down. It can be black. It can be black with the clear over it. It can be red. Red and black will keep the emergence of weed seeds down. Your clear just acts as a greenhouse for the weeds. So I prefer to go with the red or the black, and you can augment it with the clear. The clear actually brings more warmth into the soil, but you know, it's got that other little drawback. But if you put black plastic under it, then it doesn't grow weeds either, but it still brings a lot of more warmth in. So at 3 inches, you could put it in the soil, but you would need to make sure your soil is warm enough. If you plant a tomato plant at 50 degrees or a pepper plant at 50 degrees, you may stunt them for the rest of the season. They really need about 55 degrees for vegetative growth. It must be warmer, typically 65 degrees, for them to set tomatoes. Okay? We're hard pressed to get them really warm. That's why we don't plant them in the ground until June. Okay? So potting or transplanting into the ground, you want to make sure the plant is really well hydrated. You can put them into a bucket of water, and when they sink and stop bubbling, they're fully hydrated. Now, 3-inch pots have been done with typically seedling mix, which is very light, and that stuff will float your plant instead. So you're going to have to water it from above, then put it in the pot or bucket, and hold it down till it stops bubbling. Okay? But if you do that, the soil is going to hang on to the plant roots much, much better. And you want to do that at least 1 to 2 hours before you get it into the ground. Okay? So it gives you a little time to do the extra work. Again, if you're putting it into the ground, plant it deeper. For this plant, you would go through and you'd prune off anything that might end up being close. And I would probably see this one's in a little bit bigger than, but it'll still be planted quite deeply in the ground. Usually it looks like a tiny little 3 or 4 month old plant by the time I get it in the ground. I plant them pretty deeply. You're going to water and you're going to fertilize it. Okay, soil's 60 degrees, plant's hardened off, and then you get to decide how you're going to plant it. We have 2 methods that are kind of the main methods, and then there's hundreds off of that. So the first one is going to be the trench. You're going to dig down about 10 inches, kind of an oval-shaped hole. You're going to lay the plant on its side. And when it's on its side, then you're just going to make sure all those leaves that would touch the soil are gone. Why are we so concerned about a leaf touching the soil? The soil bears a lot of diseases. And many times you'll see a tomato plant that you can tell is not healthy, and it's just the bottom to begin with. And then it works its way up the plant. So try to keep your foliage off of the ground. I like a good space there. This guy, this is not really necessary. Tomato plants are extremely photosensitive, which means if they're bent or laid on their side, they will go straight up within about 2 days, and sometimes a lot faster. Usually it's 24 to 48 hours. They will grow roots all along here, and I have to say, occasionally my husband and I have broken one. You can hear it pop because it's nicely hydrated, usually right around here. And so last year when that happened, I happened to have a thin t-shirt on, cut into it, took a little strip, made a bandage, bandaged it up, and that plant grew just fine. It didn't know anything had happened. I know, it's pretty amazing. It also grew wonderful roots all along here. Always make sure that you have a label with these things. If you like it, you're going to want to repeat it probably. Now here, because it's on its side, I like to put it right at the end, and it kind of marks where the roots are so I don't disturb them when I'm weeding. Or you can use the vertical. The advantage to laying it on its side is the soil is warmer. If you dig a hole and plant the thing deeper, you're putting your plant down at the coldest part, and the cold will slow it down. It's pretty much the same method. You dig your hole, put the plant in, water it in, and you'll notice it says, place your support structure. I usually say, oh, I can do that tomorrow. These plants grow double in size every week. So that means they are growing every day. Put your structures in early. It'll yield 49% more quality fruit, keeps it up off the soil, so you have fewer diseases, fewer pests. And this is something we really need to do here is protect them the first 2 to 4 weeks that they're in the ground. Now we put them in early June. There have been a couple of times I did not take the cages off until closer to July because the air temperature was too cold. And you'll note in here, if you really look closely, of course I can't see them, but I think there's a milk jug right in here. The milk jug's filled with water. We'll take in the warmth during the day and give it off to the plant at night. Another way to warm their little individual greenhouses.
Is that plastic all the way over the top?
I have done both ways. You can put plastic all the way over the top. More recently, I've been using a row cover for the top so there's more air movement. Water the roots, not the leaves. 1 inch per week unless it's hot. If it's really hot, what's hot here? Oh, about 85 or above, okay? Every 4 to 5 days, if it's sandy, 7 to 10 if it's clay soil. You want to water early in the day so it can dry off any foliage should it get on there over the dry day. And trench watering or a drip method are really much better than doing overhead. Overhead too often just brings disease. Fertilizers, okay. N is for nitrogen. Watch your potting soils. If you pot into regular soil or regular potting soil when you go to a gallon, frequently they already have fertilizers in them. And if you get too high on nitrogen, you'll have lovely foliage, a beautiful plant, and no fruit. The center one is really what we're after, and that's why you see the ratio says 1:1. That could be like a 5-10-5, okay? And you're going to dilute it. The last one is for your roots. That's your potassium. Why it's a K, I don't know. Okay, for earlier ones, you're going to select an early ripening variety. You're going to plant it in full sun. You're going to soak the seeds and do pre-germination. You're going to repot from a small cell into a 3-inch pot using seedling mix. You're going to dilute the fertilizer to about 1/4 what it normally calls for, so every time you water, you can give it a little bit of food. Your seedling, you're going to use the heat mat and grow light. You're going to transplant it to the ground when it's about 6 to 8 inches tall in a gallon pot. And fertilizer and lime at planting, and that pretty much is going to take care of it. A lot of the information does say to give it a second round of fertilizers in early July. Well, they've only been in the ground a little while at that point, and you're going to have to do other things along the way. So let's see, I think what you can do now. Decide on the location, the orientation, the size, your water source. Any garden needs to be close to a water source. Location, think about your tallest tomatoes going on the north side of your beds. Also think about rotation, 4-year rotation on tomatoes. Make sure your soil is dry enough that you can do anything with it. If not, you can go look at the little plants that have come in and say, oh, that's way too soon for tomato plants. Decide what varieties you want to grow. Well, how do you figure out what you want to grow? Ask Bob. Yes, Bob snuck out. Anyway, you can ask Bob Woods. He's a very good tomato grower. We also say that check with your neighbors, see what they're growing. Ask the vendor. I want one for canning. They'll be able to tell you which ones will work well for canning. And you may already have your own varieties. You can buy seeds now or transplants. I usually say made for transplants because if you get a transplant now, it's going to be in a gallon pot and it's going to be harder to keep it going and it'll be real big. Okay, buy your supplies, get everything ready, and happy gardening.